Start. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to f7, check. Queen to e8, check. Queen to h6, check. Bishop to h6, check. The answer is rook to g1. Queen to e8. Queen to h6, check. King to e7. Rook to g7, check. King to d8. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop to e7. Rook takes bishop. Next puzzle, threats in this position are rook takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Queen takes knight. Bishop takes knight. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is rook takes pawn. Queen to a5. b6. Knight takes pawn. Pawn takes knight. One more. Threats in this position are queen takes bishop. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to d7, check. Queen to c8, check. Queen to f7, check. Queen to c2, check. Bishop to b6, check. The best move in puzzle position is king to d3. Queen to d1, check. Rook to d2. Queen to b1, check. Rook to c2, check. Another one. The threats are queen takes rook, check. Queen takes knight. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to g7, check. Queen takes rook, check. Queen to h7, check. Queen to h8, check. Queen to g5, check. Queen to g6, check. Answer to this puzzle is knight to g5. Pawn takes bishop. Rook to e3. Next puzzle, puzzle position vulnerabilities are there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is g6. Rook to d8, check. King to c3. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Bishop to e4. Rook to h5, check. King to a4. Rook to h4. Rook to d3, check. King to c4. b2. Promotes to queen. Promotes to queen. Queen to e8, check. King to a5. Rook to h5, check. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. King takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes rook. Checks in this position are rook takes pawn, check. Rook to h5, check. Solution to the puzzle is king takes pawn. Rook to f2. a3. Rook to f3. Rook takes pawn. Next, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes bishop. Pawn takes knight. There are no checks in this position. The answer is pawn takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to g2. Queen to h4. f5. Next, here are the threats. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes bishop. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen takes pawn. Queen to c7. King to g2. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are king takes rook. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are rook to c1, check. Queen to d3, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook, check. Queen to c2, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is queen to c2, check. King to a2. King takes rook. Rook to h1, check. King to g8. Let's continue. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to e3, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The best move in puzzle position is queen takes pawn, check. King to d1. Queen takes pawn. King to c2. Knight to d4, check. Pawn takes knight. Rook to c8, check. Another one. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes bishop. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is knight to g2, knight to c5. Bishop takes knight. Next puzzle, the threats are knight takes knight, knight takes pawn, bishop takes bishop. Checks in this position are rook to h8 check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop takes bishop, rook takes bishop, c5, knight to d5, knight to f3, rook to d3, bishop to c4, rook takes knight check, king takes rook. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are rook takes pawn, queen takes knight, pawn takes bishop, knight takes pawn. Here are the checks. Queen to h4 check, knight to d3 check, promotes to queen check, promotes to rook check. Solution to the puzzle is knight to d3 check, king to d2, b3 check, bishop takes pawn, bishop takes queen. Another puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. King takes rook. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is king takes rook, d7 check, king to e6, promotes to rook, rook takes rook, bishop takes rook, c4, pawn takes pawn, b3, bishop takes pawn, b2. One more. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes rook, bishop takes pawn, queen takes pawn, queen takes pawn check, queen takes pawn. The checks are queen to b5 check, queen to e2 check, queen takes pawn check, queen to b3 check, queen to a2 check, queen to b4 check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to e4, rook takes rook check, bishop takes rook, queen to b8, queen to c2 check. Let us go to the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Knight takes pawn, rook takes knight, queen takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are rook to g3 check. Answer to this puzzle is rook to g3 check, king to h8, queen to f5, queen to c6 check, rook to c3. Next, puzzle position vulnerabilities are rook takes rook takes pawn, rook takes knight check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to c6 check, rook takes knight check. Answer to this puzzle is rook takes knight check, king takes rook, h6, rook takes rook, pawn takes rook. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are bishop takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn, queen takes pawn, queen takes pawn check. Checks in this position are queen takes pawn check. Solution to the puzzle is f4, rook takes pawn, bishop takes rook. Another puzzle. Threats in this position are bishop takes knight, queen takes knight. Checks in puzzle position are rook to f2 check. The puzzle is solved using queen to b1, queen to f5 check, rook takes queen, pawn takes rook, queen takes pawn check, king to f3, bishop takes knight, promotes to queen, queen takes pawn check. Next, here are the threats. Knight takes pawn, queen takes pawn check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook to e7 check, queen takes pawn check. The puzzle is solved using rook to e7 check, rook to f7, knight takes pawn, queen to d4 check, queen takes queen, pawn takes queen, knight to e8 check, king to f8, rook takes rook check, king takes rook, knight to d6 check, king to f6, knight takes bishop. Another one. Threats in puzzle position are queen takes knight check, queen takes pawn check, queen takes pawn, queen takes pawn check, rook takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are knight to g6 check, queen to g7 check, queen takes knight check, queen takes pawn check, queen takes pawn check. The best move in puzzle position is rook takes pawn, pawn takes rook, queen takes pawn, knight to g6, knight takes knight check, pawn takes knight, pawn takes pawn. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in this position are Rook takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn. Rook takes knight, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are: bishop takes pawn, check. Rook takes knight, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes knight, check. King takes rook. Bishop takes pawn. Knight takes bishop. Knight takes knight, check. Rook takes knight. Rook takes rook. Another puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: knight takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. The checks are: rook to h1, check. Solution to the puzzle is: queen to h6. Rook to d1. Bishop to g4. Next, the threats are: rook takes pawn. Checks in this position are: rook to g6, check. Answer to this puzzle is: rook to g6, check. King to f7. Rook takes pawn. King to e7. Rook to g6. Next, puzzle position vulnerabilities are: queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Checks in this position are: queen to g7, check. Queen to g8, check. Queen to h7, check. Queen to h6, check. Queen to h5, check. Queen to f6, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to h5, check. King to g8. Bishop takes pawn. Queen to e7. Queen takes knight, check. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.